here's my talk, Cinco Sins of Psychedelic Science. Yes, it is I did make it Cinco Sins of Psychedelic Science, not only because of the alliteration, not only because I couldn't figure out how to get seven sins, but also it kind of shows you an interesting it shows you what's interesting in English is that you can have four different ways of saying "sa." I realize cinco is Spanish and Portuguese, but we have other words like cigarette with CI. So anyways, there's four different ways you can get the S sound in English. Okay, so here we go. So we're, more than 15 years into the psychedelic renaissance. I probably need to update this slide and start putting like 20 years into the psychedelic renaissance. It basically, some people would say that it started with this paper. There were actually psychedelic studies happening around that time, not only, of course, in Germany. There had already been some studies since the 90s, of course, in Switzerland from Franz Bohlenbeider's group. There were also actually studies in the US as well with psychedelics as well as other hallucinogens. But this was the study that kind of, kicked things off. It gained a lot of traction. And I have some things to say about it. But, and I do realize that that's my former boss, Roland, on there. But I'll get into that later. And so since then, we've had hundreds of new publications every year. I don't know if at some point I probably need to update that to say thousands. It says 10 plus new centers and groups. This again was, I made this, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. There's probably 50 centers around the world at this point. And there's billions of dollars worth of companies, although I might have to update that to actually reduce that number, given that a lot of these companies are going under at this point. And so, this has led to claims like this, that simply scanning the brain on LSD, people have said that this is to neuroscience what the Higgs boson was to particle physics. That is an absurd statement. we've learned nothing in neuroscience really from psychedelics. That's a point that I'll make later. There's also been claims like this. This person thinks that actions of these drugs are now pretty well understood. Even though that the next line there from Felix Mueller says that everything is quite unclear. So I do think now at this point, people are trying to be a little bit more critical. I think that hype is starting to, be withdrawn a little bit. And so here, though, is at least 5, I think, distinct things that I think we could do better in psychedelic research. So here's my outline. I will reveal the sins to you one at a time. And so the first one is going to be an overemphasis on the default mode network. So first of all, what is the default mode network? So for those of you that don't know, if you, for example, scan the brain with fMRI, you can take the time series of brain activity from 2 or more brain areas and see how well they correlate with each other. So you can see here that, for example, the main hubs of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, et cetera, that their brain activity tends to track each other. And so we can look at measures like functional connectivity, which is in many situations just basically a Pearson's R, and say that, okay, hey, the functional connectivity tends to be high. These brain regions tend to form this network. And so the default network has been shown to be involved in various functions that involve internal mentation, such as episodic memory, semantic memory, future simulation, mind wandering, and even social processing, such as theory of mind. So, is like trying to figure out what someone else is thinking. And so that, which is kind of ironic because it's also involved in self-referential processing, which is kind of the opposite of social processing. But because it's involved in self-referential processing, some time ago, people, even before a lot of the psychedelic studies were coming out, the psychedelic neuroimaging studies, these people, Carhart, Harris, and Friston, proposed that this was the Freudian ego, which I find to be absurd because I thought Freud was dead. And as it turns out, it was shown that in one particular study that the acute effects of psilocybin decreased functional connectivity, essentially the coherence, how well these, the coupling of these regions within this network. This was replicated with other psychedelics. So, and in fact, in one of these studies, there was even a correlation with a subjective measure of ego dissolution, so that the more that somebody's default mode network lost its coupling, the more ego dissolution there was. And so there was, there was a couple iterations, but here was the latest one, was then this, there's another one now, but this was, I think, maybe the one that's most known, is this led to this model that was known as Rebus for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And so in Rebus, they posit that essentially the default mode network is at the top of the brain's hierarchy. So, you process sensory information through all your primary sensory areas, and they go up through secondary sensory areas and become more abstracted until finally, they reach these levels. They reach the highest level, the default mode network. And so the idea here is that if the king collapses, then there'll be all this chaos in the brain. And the way that this chaos is measured is through measures of complexity or entropy. And so by, essentially removing, the top of the hierarchy, this can allow for more bottom-up information processing, more sensory kind of there's more sensitivity of sensory information, and that this should then, for whatever reason, also result in more kind of entropy or more number of brain states, ways in which the brain might, process the world. And so I have some issues. Oh yeah, and then Michael Pollan was, kind of popularized this narrative. For whatever reason, that was the only neuroscientist he decided to interview, and it now made it seem like fact that this was the default narrative. The default mode network was the default narrative for psychedelic research. So let's look at this a little bit deeper. So first of all, how specific and reliable are modulations of the default mode network during resting state? So this, by the way, all these findings are strictly during resting state, when people are doing absolutely nothing in the scanner while they're high on psychedelics, and then while they're doing absolutely nothing in the scanner while they are sober. So you compare those two states, and this is, that's how you get what you get here. And so when people have done the same sorts of things with salvinorin A, that was actually a study of mine, as well as you can also see decreases in default mode network functional connectivity. So some people say, okay, well, salvinorin A is a hallucinogen. Well, you can also see this with THC. Well, some people say THC can be kind of hallucinogenic psychedelic. Well, you can see this with alcohol, a drug that doesn't make people, alcohol and amphetamine, drugs that don't make people ego dissolved. They make them egotistical sometimes. You can also see this with a single non-psychoactive dose of an SSRI. So this doesn't seem to be, this isn't a very unique signature. But now how about a drug that people compare, psychedelics to frequently? And when I say psychedelics here, I really do mean the serotonin 2A hallucinogens. Well, probably the primary drug of a different pharmacological class that people compare psychedelics to would be ketamine. Whoops. And as it turns out, with ketamine, there's actually quite unreliable effects. So 3 studies have found decreases in functional connectivity within the default mode network under the effects of ketamine. 2 studies found null findings, and that last study that found increases in default mode network connectivity, that is the largest multi-site ketamine resting state study that exists. So, I mean, to me, that just looks like an overall null effect. There's also unreliable post-acute changes from psychedelics in the default mode network. So, Rebus is really meant to be more of a kind of acute drug effect story, but they do talk about how, well, there might be these lingering changes in the subsequent days. So there are 3 studies that found that following the acute effects of a psychedelic, you can get decreases in functional connectivity within the default mode network. There's also 3 studies that found really basically no effects in the default mode network. And then there's 1 study by the proponents of Rebus that found increases in functional connectivity within the default mode network. And here's the best part. There's a study by them that actually found that depending on how you analyze your data or which data set you analyze, you can get decreases, no changes, or increases in functional connectivity within the default mode network. We actually critiqued this paper. That was the paper that I critiqued, me and a couple other people, and it led to a whole shitstorm and this Vice article by Shayla Love. And then so, but it's actually worth mentioning that there's also unreliable changes in the default mode network in depression. So there was this meta-analysis of like 500 plus people that showed that essentially that there was increases in default mode network connectivity in patients with depression. Well, then more recently, there was a study that actually looked at over 1,000 patients with depression, and they found that there was actually decreases in default mode network connectivity. So this is not, if you ask me, a good biomarker for depression or perhaps even, the effects of psychedelics. Although I will say, the acute effects of psychedelics are somewhat reliable on this, but I don't know what it really means. It's hard to say, especially when you're looking at something like resting state. So what about, I mentioned that the whole thing, well, what does it mean? So I mentioned the whole idea that there was 1 study that found if you look at the changes in default mode network functional connectivity, you can see that there's a correlation with ego dissolution. So the larger the decrease in default mode network functional connectivity, the more ego dissolution people experienced. So what's really great is that somebody tried to directly replicate this with more data, and their participants moved less, and they basically got a correlation of zero. So, and nobody ever cites this, by the way. Everybody will always cite the correlation with ego dissolution. Nobody ever cites the fact that a direct attempt at replicating this with better data could not find it, could not find that correlation. And as far as I know, I don't think anybody has since replicated that finding. And just to be clear, if you're ever looking at a post hoc correlation of some subjective measure with a resting state functional connectivity measure, you're not gonna be able to replicate it. It doesn't work. It's just, I think it's a bad practice that people should honestly just stop doing. Okay, so let's think about some predictions from this default mode network narrative and then see what the reality is right now. So some years ago, we nominated the default mode network as the primary biological substrate of the Freudian ego. We still largely maintain these views. Well, I just told you that correlations with ego dissolution didn't replicate. There's actually also been a lot of correlations with ego dissolution across several other brain areas that aren't involved in the default mode network. And I don't think any of those replicate either, but the point is that this doesn't seem to be specific to the default mode network. Okay, so another prediction is that there should be the largest effects of psychedelics should be in the default mode network. Well, here's a handful of studies with just looking at functional connectivity that actually found stronger effects in sensory networks, which is kind of like the opposite. Because what they'll say is that there should be higher, they should, if not the default mode network, there should be stronger effects in higher level regions. There are studies that find effects in sensory networks that are larger. Okay, one idea is that there should be essentially this release of bottom-up information flow up through like higher level cortices. And they refer to the hippocampus as being a lower level region, which I take some issue with. If you ever look at the Van Essen diagram of the visual like the dorsal and ventral visual processing streams, they converge at the hippocampus. So it's unclear, if you ask me, where the hippocampus sits in a hierarchy, but to them, the hippocampus is the id and the default mode network is the ego, and that there should be more of like information flow between the hippocampus to the cortex. As it turns out, their own data, as well as several other people's and one animal study, have actually found that there's a decoupling between the hippocampus and the cortex. So if anything, there's just less information going between the two. Um, As I mentioned, there should be this, facilitation of bottom-up information flow. And this does seem to happen during rest. I will admit that. But there are cases, including by the proponents of the default mode network narrative, which, they won't cite these studies when they're trying to push this idea, but that there are cases in which you do get top-down facilitation. It's also worth noting that a hallucination, in some ways, by definition, is a kind of a top-down effect. You have to have some high, like if you're going to, let's say, hallucinate your mother, you have to have some type of high-level concept of who your mother is, and that information needs to impinge on sensory areas so that you perceive your mother. And I realize that, true hallucinations are, somewhat rare under psychedelics, but if you put somebody under a high dose of a psychedelic and lay them, on a couch with eye shades on, they will sometimes not realize what's going on and see things that aren't actually there. Okay, and then there's this prediction that the brain's hierarchy breaks down. And I'm still a little confused what that means beyond beyond like what mathematically, but if you think about just kind of like from the actual like stimulus processing of information, there's not really a breakdown of the brain's hierarchy. Retinotopy, tonotopy, and place fields are all preserved under the effects of psychedelics. Okay, so, there's multiple models of psychedelic drug action, and, Rebus is one of them. This was our attempt at trying to circuitify Rebus. It's actually a very ambiguous, when it comes to looking at, thinking about neural circuits, it's actually quite ambiguous. And this was our best effort to try to, sort out what it is, based on some of the what they said explicitly in that paper. Here's another model that I think, has a little bit more, it respects the anatomy of the brain. This is one of the first models that, was proposed by Franz Wollenweiter, and one of the first circuit level models proposed by Franz Wollenweiter and Mark Geyer, the cortical striatal thalamic cortical model, or the thalamic gating model. I think there's actually, if not more evidence for this from resting state data, if you ask me. Although there are some nuances there, just to be clear, and you should read the paper to figure out what those are. We also in this paper propose this cortical cluster cortical model, and it involves the claustrum, which has this tiny strip of gray matter that has some high expression of serotonin 2A receptors and projects throughout the brain. If you ask me, it was a little premature. That wasn't the part that I wrote as much of. But we wanted to get the idea out there since there's a lot of interest in the claustrum, and there's now kind of some new methods to potentially measure claustral activity from fMRI. But I think really what we need is to stop doing resting state, and we need to understand how psychedelics impact behaviors that are dependent on these circuits to try to figure out which one of these circuit models actually might predict psychedelic drug effects the most. And so this brings me to memory, which is something that I study. So memory is not a unitary construct. There are all types of different memory systems that rely on different regions in the brain. Of course, these different memory systems interact, but here's kind of like a simple schematic of the way to think about memory. And if we were interested in what's going on in, let's say, rebus, for example, then we should probably be interested over here. This is the kind of episodic memory, semantic memory memory system. And it involves the medial temporal lobe, so not just the hippocampus, but some of the cortices surrounding it. I just want to say that this, if you were interested in the CSTC model, you might want to start querying these types of behaviors, this type of memory system, so procedural memory. And I think that would be a great PhD project for somebody one day. Okay, but let's talk about episodic memory. So Endel Tolving is kind of he's the father of episodic memory. He died only, what, a year and a half ago or something. He really, is kind of like fundamental to a lot of, the study of cognitive neuroscience. So he came up with this dichotomy before we really had, any, brain imaging to really kind of support it. But he had this differentiation between episodic memory and semantic memory. So episodic memory is the re-experiencing of information from the past. Because it involves this ability to kind of mentally time travel, he referred to the experience as autonoetic consciousness. In contrast, there's semantic memory, which is more involves this feeling of knowing for facts, concepts, beliefs, etc. And so, for example, you might know that, well, maybe some of you don't, because I don't assume all of you are American, but the first president of the US is George Washington. I don't have the episodic memory for where and when I learned that information. I just know that George Washington is the first president of the country. And he referred to this experience because it doesn't involve traveling to the past to try to recall these details. He referred to this experience as noetic consciousness, which, might overlap with what some of you all know as the noetic quality under the effects of psychedelics, this undeniable sense of knowledge that one feels like they're getting. And so Tolving came up with this idea before there was really great brain data, but in the 90s, there was this model that was proposed called the complementary learning systems model, which kind of gave some evidence for this idea, that this dichotomy that Tolving proposed. And so essentially the idea is that the hippocampus is this really fast learner that binds a bunch of disparate pieces of information, and then it essentially trains the cortex to over time instantiate semantic memories by extracting the statistical regularities across different episodes. And so, for example, let's say the first time you ate a pizza, you probably had an episodic memory for it. You probably had an episodic memory for the first several times you ate a pizza. And then over time, what you did was you extracted the statistical regularities for, what was happening across those episodes. That is, what a pizza looks like, tastes like, smells like, etc. And by the end of, let's say the 20th time, the 100th time you ate a pizza, you no longer have the episodic memories for the first time you ate a pizza, but you do probably have a overall semantic memory that's like a semi-permanent sort of storage of what a pizza is. So there's also this other dichotomy in the episodic memory literature that's a little bit more recent, known as recollection and familiarity. So essentially, when you're trying to retrieve a memory, you can use the hippocampus and recall kind of specific details like where or when an event took place. And so that's maybe more of what we would think about as our classic episodic memory. In contrast, there's what's known as familiarity. And this involves this cortical dependent feeling of knowing that something has happened without necessarily knowing why that is. So a lot of times we might, for example, be at a conference and we can see that we can recognize someone's face and say, oh, I know I've met that person before, but I can't remember where I met them, when I met them, what their name is, etc. So that would be familiarity in the absence of recollection. So essentially one idea is that essentially that processing fluency, this is the ease of information processing in semantic memory, can produce familiarity. So essentially, if I activate, some semantic memory recently, then this will produce a sense of familiarity the next time I see this information. And yeah, as it turns out, that the temporal lobe, especially let's say the anterior temporal lobe, is a hub for semantic memory, familiarity, fluency, etc. So now, with this little background in episodic memory, how now do psychedelics impact, episodic memory, these different memory systems? And so it turns out the highest density of serotonin 2A receptors are in the cortex. And although people love to, focus on how they're in the default mode network, they are actually in quite a few different areas, including the salience network. Also, the highest expression is right there. That is in the middle posterior temporal gyrus. That is sometimes grouped in with the default mode network, but it's definitely not a hub of the default mode network. But as it turns out, it is a hub of the semantic memory network, which is basically the default mode network, but more kind of it's kind of more lateral and anterior regions. And so, as it turns out, the serotonin 2A expression in the cortex tends to be more on excitatory neurons, whereas there are serotonin 2A receptors in the hippocampus. Not a whole lot, but there are quite a few. But they tend to be on inhibitory neurons. And although there's not as many serotonin 2A receptors there, I think it's something like over 50% of inhibitory neurons in the hippocampus express serotonin 2A receptors. The problem is, I think it's a 1-to-4 ratio of inhibitory neurons to excitatory neurons. But this does suggest that there's some important coding that's happening with serotonin 2A receptors in the hippocampus. So now, how might psychedelics impact these different memory systems? Well, there's one idea that there's ego dissolution under the effects of psychedelics. There's also the noetic quality under the effects of psychedelics. So if I were Endel Tolving, I might say something like, well, under the effects of psychedelics, there's a loss of autonoetic consciousness, and then there's like a facilitation of noetic consciousness. It's also been shown actually that psilocybin can enhance semantic priming, which, as I mentioned, this is basically, a form of processing fluency. So this might already kind of give you an idea of what I'm about to show you. But before I do, I just need to really hammer down. There's a couple things. If you're ever studying any form of memory and drugs, you always have to consider what phase of memory is the drug hitting. So in a classic, sort of episodic memory task, we have the encoding phase where we show you a bunch of stimuli like a cat, a rollerblade, a hammer. And then you later on then test people's memory during the retrieval phase where, in this case, like a recognition memory test, where I show you all the images that you previously saw intermixed with brand new images. So for example, now you get a picture of a cat to which you should say, yes, I saw that picture. And then you can get a picture of, let's say, a ketchup bottle, and you should say, no, I did not see that picture. And then in this case, what we'll do is we'll collect confidence data, and that allows us to model the different memory processes, but I will get into that now. But what I really want to, hammer down is when you administer that drug and when you test people's memory can drastically change what you end up finding. So if I administer a drug prior to the encoding phase, that's going to impact encoding. But if I test people's memory immediately afterwards, you're now also impacting the retrieval phase. And so let me just give you to kind of solidify how different of effects you can get from different drugs. I'm going to show you what happens with alcohol if you administer alcohol immediately before the encoding phase or immediately after the encoding phase. So here's two different, what I'm showing you here are parameter estimates from a computational model where we essentially try to separate recollection and familiarity. Recollections in the top panel, familiarities in the bottom panel. That gray distribution will always be your placebo condition. Anything to the left of that will be an impairment. Anything to the right of that will be an enhancement. And in blue, what you can see is that's when alcohol is administered prior to encoding. And, surprise, surprise, alcohol impaired people's memories. That is, if you study drunk, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test. However, if you administer alcohol immediately after studying, you will actually get an enhancement in your memory that's known as retrograde facilitation. And I know that that sounds like that's too good to be true, but this effect has actually been shown since 1980. It has been shown across all various different labs, all kinds of different study and test materials, pictures, words, emotional pictures and words. It's been shown with different delays between the study and test phases, the encoding and retrieval phases. So here we used a 48-hour delay, but other people have done 24 hours. People have tested people very shortly afterwards. It's also been shown with other GABA A positive allosteric modulators. So it's been shown with benzodiazepines and Ambien or zolpidem. So I don't want to say that, everybody should go get wasted after this, in order to remember what I'm telling you, but I am going to say this is a very robust effect that's been replicated by numerous groups around the world. Okay, so what I want you to focus on, though, is really now what happens with drug effects on memory encoding. And so I had in this project, what I did was that I reanalyzed a bunch of different memory data. Most of the drug manipulations were administered prior to encoding. And what you can see is here's a bunch of other GABA A positive allosteric modulators, benzodiazepines, and Ambien, impaired recollection and familiarity. Surprise. You now administer dissociatives. So this would be ketamine and dextromethorphan. Also impairments in recollection and familiarity. THC, you also get impairments in recollection and familiarity. But what about MDMA? So MDMA is a weird drug. It has some stimulant effects. It has, it's, kind of entactogen or empathogenic effects. A lot of people might not realize this, but our MDMA, the right-handed version, actually does bind to the serotonin 2A receptor. And people have actually shown if you administer a serotonin 2A antagonist, you can actually remove the impairments on hippocampal-dependent memory. So here with MDMA, we replicated those impairments in hippocampal-dependent memory. Just look at the blue distribution, which is MDMA encoding. However, we got this enhancement in familiarity. If you look at the original MDMA paper where I published this, I don't focus on that enhancement familiarity because one, it was like a 0.06 p-value or something like that. And two, I didn't believe it. I didn't think that that was actually real. However, I later found this with psilocybin. And the funny thing is those were also statistical trends, but the trend got larger and larger as we cranked up the dose. That last dose is 30 milligrams of psilocybin, which is something like 5 grams of mushrooms, a dose at which people are barely functional, and yet we're starting to see this enhancement of familiarity. So more recently, I collaborated with Maastricht University, and we looked at the impact of psilocybin and 2CB on a memory test to see if we could replicate this. And here's what we found. We didn't get much of an impairment in recollection, and we got an impairment in familiarity. So this is actually published, by the way. I should have updated that. So this was a little weird. But I think this has to do with an artifact of how we ended up measuring memory. First of all, there did appear to be trends for an impairment in recollection. You can look at the supplement, you can look at the stats for different measures of recollection that we have in there. But here's what we found with familiarity. But here's why I don't think what we found with familiarity is actually an impairment. But I do want to point out that even if it were a real impairment of familiarity, no drug impairs familiarity more so than recollection. All of those drugs impaired recollection, and it's only at their higher doses do you get impairments of familiarity. Here we're getting strictly an impairment of familiarity, which is just weird. But here's why I don't think it's a real impairment of familiarity. It's based on the task that we used. So we had an encoding phase where we showed people a bunch of labels that were sometimes followed by their corresponding picture. So, you get this cute mouse eating lettuce, you get the label for that, and then you get a picture of a cute mouse eating lettuce. You get this label for lobsters for sale at the stand, and then you never get the pictures of the lobsters. And then later on, 24 hours later, we then test your memory where we show you all of those labels that you previously saw, the ones that came with a picture as well as the ones that didn't. And we ask you, did you see this label as a picture? So they should say when they get the label for the cute mouse eating lettuce, they should say, yes, I saw a picture of that. When they get the lobsters for sale at the stand, they should say, no, I never saw a picture of that. However, we administered psilocybin and 2CB prior to memory encoding. So now if psychedelics are enhancing familiarity, they're not going to just enhance the familiarity of this picture. They're also going to enhance the familiarity for the label. So that way, during retrieval, when you end up getting the label for, let's say, lobsters for sale at the stand, that's going to feel highly familiar to you. And you might then infer, oh, maybe it's because I saw a picture of this. If you then false alarm and say that I saw a picture of this with moderate levels of confidence, that will produce an impairment in that parameter estimate. So it's in some ways an artifact of the task that we use in the computational model. But what's really nice is that we had this second memory test, this picture recognition memory test, where we just showed you all of the images that you previously saw intermixed with the images that you never actually got. And we had a separate way of measuring recollection and familiarity where we could actually get familiarity for false alarms. And as it turns out, false alarms increased during that phase that were based strictly on familiarity from both 2CB and psilocybin. So in other words, I think that familiarity was being enhanced, except that it was being misattributed to stimuli that such that it impaired task performance. So I just want to say that all of this is relevant to the default mode network, given that semantic memory and episodic memory are largely supported by the default mode network, although different parts of the default mode network. They're also, by the way, very distinct processes if you think about it. One involves like mental time travel, relies on the hippocampus. The other one is kind of the absence of the sense of self. It's memory that's absent of the sense of self. And so, I think we need to be thinking a little bit deeper about what the default mode network is doing. A lot of people think I'm a default mode network hater. I love it. I just don't think that the way we're talking about it with psychedelics is very useful. And so, Michael Pollan, there was this interview of me where, they asked me about, some of my takes. And, Michael Pollan tweeted it and said that it referred to me as a revisionist because I, was kind of hating on the default mode network narrative, which I thought was a little rude because I don't feel like the term revisionist has a good connotation. It's like historical revision. I don't think that he wrote the history of psychedelics. So, that made me feel a certain type of way. But you know what, Michael Pollan, check it out. The default mode network narrative man himself has literally said that narratives have been too default mode network centric. So there you have it. Okay, so on to sin number 2, over-reliance on resting state fMRI. George, what time, by the way, what time is this class finish?
Well, you get 90 minutes and you can do what you like with it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I am currently I'm at like 45 minutes or something, or nearly. Okay, so I might have to rush through some other things. But okay, let's now move on to this idea of this over-reliance on resting state. So first of all, I think this is in part, these two things are actually quite related. So if you were looking at resting state and you're giving people a drug that makes people not rest, well, what are you going to see? You're going to see changes in a network that tends to be more active when people are resting and internally mentalizing. And so I think that, it's kind of like, well, this will lead to changes in the default mode network, which is why we're focusing on it. But I think also, but let me just move on to what I'm trying to say here. So first of all, psychedelics were not initially studied with resting state. So the first fMRI studies actually contained tasks. And I think this is a German, right? Guzilis Mayfrank. I think. And so she had actually really good insight as to why we should be using tasks. However, resting state is a poorly defined mental condition, especially under powerful psychoactive substances. Resting state might represent completely different mental activities across subjects. Thus, a uniform mental activation with a simple cognitive task such as word repetition may indeed contribute to a better comparability of functional imaging scans across substances, besides being an adequate control for the cognitive activation of the association task. So this was a really good insight. And, this was back in 1999. And I think it actually does explain a lot of the psychedelic effects that we're getting now. So a lot of people are probably aware of how psychedelics supposedly increase between network functional connectivity. So here was a study that actually looked at 3 different studies and their changes in between network functional connectivity. On each axis, you have a network in the brain. So, for example, this will be your, the network 1 and its functional connectivity to network 3. And the point that they were trying to make here is that, so each one of these different colored asterisks is a different study, is that across all 3 studies, and I forget how many ways, when you have 10 different networks, it ends up being something like, I forgot. It's what the n choose k of the binomial factorial is. It's something like 90, is it 40 or 90 different ways to pair up these different brain networks. Across these 3 studies, there was not a single overlap between all 3 studies and increases in between network functional connectivity. In other words, if everybody's doing different stuff in the scanner across these tiny sample sizes, then you're never going to find the same networks are increasing their functional connectivity very reliably. And so actually back in 2007, when resting state was kind of coming out, Paul Fletcher had actually wrote this paper that says, does the brain have a baseline? Why we should be resisting arrest? There is no baseline to the brain. And then oddly enough, history is now repeating itself. A few years ago, Emily Finn just wrote this paper, Is It Time to Put Rest to Rest? So what the hell happened? Well, I think it comes back to that initial psilocybin fMRI study that really set the ground for how people decided to study psychedelics. It also was at a time where a lot of clinical neuroimaging was, not being done by, cognitive neuroscientists. It was being done by clinicians. And it's just easier to throw somebody in the scanner for 5 to 10 minutes and just scan their brain and just look at, functional connectivity and not have to think about what's going on in the mind. And so since then, all kinds of people have followed suit and done the exact same thing, including myself. So just to be clear, I am quite guilty here, but I have started resisting arrest. Okay, so task-based fMRI. So by using tasks, we can actually kind of constrain interpretations of tasks as well as behavior. We can constrain the interpretations of what different, what brain activity might mean. And so you can also, by the way, still look at intrinsic functional connectivity. So there's this idea that, okay, regardless of what types of what you're doing and, what the behavior is, what stimuli you're looking at, that there's kind of a scaffolding in the brain that is hard to perturb in the first place. And so we can still actually look at measures of functional connectivity while people are doing tasks. You can actually you can just forget that the task is there and just treat the whole time series like a resting state data set. People have actually done this with dextromethorphan. And they actually found that, oh, hey, under the effects of this hallucinogen that you get as well as in schizophrenia, while people are doing the NBAC, you can actually show that there's more kind of what's related to entropy, more brain states. And I think it actually makes more sense to do this. That is, if really we should be doing multiple tasks, analyzing it like resting state, and the only effects we should care about is what holds up across all of those tasks. Because if just showing people a little bit of stimuli or having them push a few buttons is totally abolishing your effect, you weren't looking at intrinsic connectivity in the first place. You weren't looking at that scaffolding that the brain is supposedly bootstrapping off of to do cognition. And so it's also been shown actually that tasks, that analyzing your data like rest, while people do a task is better than resting state data for various sorts of predictive models, like predicting, for example, clinical symptoms or predicting, cognition, measures of cognition. And people have actually said that, there's been a little bit of a turn recently where there's been a couple of these papers that came out that said, before we start querying the brain, we need well-defined behaviors. And I highly recommend reading these two papers by John Krakauer and Yael Neve. Okay, so the other issue with resting state that I've been alluding to is that the use of brain is what's known as reverse inference. So people will reverse inference the idea that it came out actually because of task-based fMRI. People were showing people pictures of, let's say, George Bush. They'd see the amygdala go off and they'd say, oh, people are scared when they see George Bush. And so, so that's, at least in that situation, you have some constraints. You scan a bunch of, woke liberals and they look at, Trump and then their amygdala goes off. It's maybe not the worst reverse inference to think that they're a little scared. But that problem becomes even worse when you're looking at resting state, because you really have no idea what's going on in people's heads. And so this reverse inference is essentially the idea that you can't look at brain activity and infer mental functions because there's all kinds of different patterns of brain activity you can get for distinct reasons. So just looking at faces versus shapes, you will get more amygdala activity. I think if you look at like checkerboards versus a gray screen, you will get more amygdala activity because it's involved in salience. So we need ways of constraining our interpretations. So let me just give you some examples of what I've seen in the psychedelic literature and some alternatives that honestly probably make more sense. So decreases in devolvent activity and functional connectivity. The results suggest that decreased activity and connectivity in the brain's connector hubs permitting an unconstrained style of cognition. Well, the alternative, deep networks involved in episodic memory, as I mentioned, future simulation, mind wandering, semantic memory, etc. So it could just be that episodic memory was taken down under the effects of psychedelic. It's also the case that default network activity tends to go down when your attention is directed outwards. When you're on a psychedelic and you're like have all this chaotic, back and forth between your environment and not, that should actually decrease your default mode network activity and functional connectivity compared to a sober condition in which you're probably actually resting and probably falling asleep, frankly, in the scanner. I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, increased default mode network, task positive network functional connectivity. This was the idea that, there's disturbed ego boundaries, that, this network that's involved in externally directing your attention and one that's involved in internally directing your attention, they're somewhat anti-correlated, and now they're coming together, and this makes you, your environment and your ego, now they're kind of, coming together, they're joining together. This also happens when you're doing cognitive control and goal-directed tasks. You can also get increased connectivity between those two networks. It's also shown in ADHD that you can get increased connectivity between these networks. Under the effects of psychedelic, your attention is impaired. I think that's an easy explanation rather than disturbed ego boundaries. Increased complexity. So, this is like that entropy or complexity metrics. They've shown that this is related to the id. I don't quite understand that one, but that is an interpretation. It's also been shown that in OCD, as well as when you fail to retrieve a memory, that the brain can become more complex. So again, you might fail to be able to retrieve certain memories because you're not encoding them very well under a psychedelic. That could just as easily explain these findings from resting state. So let's now look at let's do a little thought experiment and look at, let's dig deeper into this idea of brain complexity and why there's a particular reverse inference that I really hated that I just saw recently. So first of all, 40% of people will fall asleep and will report falling asleep in the scanner during eyes open conditions. And so, that's pretty interesting. This was a large study. It was like 150 people, and that's 40% of people reporting. They're probably underreporting because they didn't want to piss off the researcher and say, oh, sorry, I fell asleep in the scanner. That's eyes open conditions. Psychedelic imaging studies have been doing eyes closed conditions, and they even recommended doing eyes closed conditions. Note that I am an author on there. I did try to push back. I unfortunately did not push back enough on this recommendation. So if people are closing their eyes during psychedelic studies, and it's, let's say, a more than 40, we're looking at probably 50% of people falling asleep in the scanner during the placebo conditions. So could these complexity increases in the brain simply be due to performing a range of cognitive operations on a drug that keeps one awake? You're really just comparing awake versus asleep, right? And note that those cognitive operations don't necessarily have to be anything unique to the psychedelic experience. For example, if I'm awake on a psychedelic, I could be wondering what the researcher wants out of my brain. I could be paying attention to those scanner sounds. I could be thinking about my mother. All of these things are things I can do when I'm sober and will show increases in complexity in the brain, but they have nothing to do with what's unique about the psychedelic experience. So let's do this little thought experiment. If we had people, let's say that we had people under a psychedelic do, let's say, not very complex things in the scanner, like just resting there, and then do more complex things in the scanner, like doing a bunch of math, let's say. So under drug-free conditions, what you would expect is that the complexity of the brain might go up, that when they're resting there and falling asleep versus when they're, doing a bunch of complex math in their head, you'll get somewhat of an increase in complexity. But now, under psychedelics, if complexity these measures of entropy or complexity were indexing something unique about the psychedelic experience beyond these mundane cognitive operations, we should see that overall the complexity under psychedelics will always be above what's under drug-free conditions. And in fact, if we have people try to do some mundane cognitive things like doing math, you might even see decreases in the complexity under the effects of a psychedelic. So here I have complexity of cognitive operations on the X, complexity of neural activity on the Y. Okay, so this is a study that we actually proposed. We sort of proposed this idea in that circuit model paper in Brain. What's really nice is that the proponents of the default mode network narrative and these complexity metrics actually did the study for us. And here's what they found. They did not find that. What they found, so on here, what we have on the x-axis is complexity of cognitive operations. So we have eyes closed, resting state. We have eyes closed, listening to music. We have eyes open, and then people are watching a movie. So the complexity of cognitive operations is going up. And then on the y-axis is a measure of complexity known as Lempel-Ziv. It's a measure of how compressible a signal is. And what you can see is that, yeah, it is true that if you increase the cognitive operations under placebo, you will get an increase in the brain's complexity. Surprise, surprise. If you do stuff in the scanner, your brain becomes more complex. However, what's interesting under LSD is that if you do stuff in the scanner, you also see somewhat of an increase in complexity. However, what's worth noting is that by the very end, when you're watching a video, there's really no difference between the complexity of under LSD versus placebo. And what was really, really nice, this is with MEG, by the way. So, a measure of kind of magnetic or electrophysiological activity. But what's interesting is that this was also shown recently with fMRI. So it's really cool. It's actually really cool that these two different methods converged. But they're cool for the wrong reasons. And so what they actually found here now is that now this is just showing you that they had a task, a boring perceptual task, and they had a resting state condition. And under sober conditions, complexity in the brain went up when you had people perform a task. It also numerically went up when you were performing the task under placebo versus rest. But overall, when you got to performing a task under drug-free conditions, there really wasn't much of a difference between psilocybin and that drug-free condition. However, because the effect between psilocybin and sobriety went away during that task condition, they refer to this as grounding. That is not grounding. This figure up here would suggest grounding. What the idea should be that your complexity should go down while doing a task. That would reflect grounding, not the fact that the effect went away because complexity went up under sober conditions. So this is, super problematic of an interpretation. It's literally just interpreting a two-way interaction. And yet somehow this, got messed up as being an interpretation of grounding. And instead what you're showing is that if you do stuff in the scanner, you get more complexity in the brain, including under sober conditions, which again is really cool that can be shown with both fMRI and MEG, but it doesn't really tell us anything interesting about psychedelics. Okay, so here's been some poor reasons for not using tasks that are in the literature. There's been people who say that there's generalized disengagement, so that under the effects of a psychedelic, that people are just unable to engage in a task. Well, first of all, that's true of every drug as well as every clinical population. That is psychedelic exceptionalism to say that, oh, psychedelics are a special case here. Second, as I mentioned, there are cases in which you can get enhanced cognition. So for example, there's enhanced semantic priming under the effects of psilocybin. There's also these certain types of double dissociations that cannot be explained by generalized disengagement. So in this study, they found that dextromethorphan impaired episodic memory more than working memory, whereas psilocybin impaired working memory more than episodic memory. So if there was just more generalized disengagement under the effects of psilocybin, there should just be overall more impairments under psilocybin, but instead they found this double dissociation. Okay, this is just absurd, but another reason people have literally claimed not to use tasks in the scanner is they cite Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I kid you not. I don't even want to get into this, but the idea that, oh, if you try to perturb the system that you can't measure it. Well, by the way, you're measuring the system with fMRI regardless if you give them a task. So this is just an absurd misunderstanding of what the uncertainty principle is. I don't want to get into this. Okay, so let's move on to sin 3. I think luckily this is a pretty short sin. I think we're already at the near hour mark. So this is now what's known as like salami slicing with small samples. So why then has why has there been placed so much importance on this default network narrative if it's got so many flaws within it? Because even the methods that it's based on, resting state, is so ambiguous in terms of the interpretations. Well, I think salami slicing has something to do with this. So salami slicing is when you make multiple publications based on tiny data sets, especially with the goal of trying to provide more evidence towards your model. And the problem is that this exaggerates the amount of perceived evidence there is for your model because it's not based on independent samples. And so, there's already problems with fMRI that people have highlighted that are much smarter than me, like Russ Poldrack, known as researcher degrees of freedom. There's so many different decisions at every point of analysis with fMRI that you can get all kinds of different findings. As I mentioned, the deep follow network can increase, decrease, or have no impact, or you can have no impact on it. The post-acute effects of psychedelics can have decreases, increases, or no impact, depending on how you analyze your data. So, there's a lot of issues with salami slicing that, that definitely bother me. And I think one way of at least getting around salami slicing is that if you're ever going to run a new analysis that's meant to support your model, find another data set and show that both analyses show up in both data sets. Okay, but here's some examples of salami slicing that I see. It's really popular to do this in the psychedelic world. So there was a study where they looked at emotional processing. They had a behavioral task, and they had just a pure behavioral task, and then they had an amygdala reactivity task. They could have combined all of that into a single study. Instead, there's a behavioral study, and then there's two separate amygdala activation studies. One's actually a functional connectivity, but yeah, both. So two separate. So three different publications, all based on a single set of I think it was 15 to 20 subjects. There's this one study here that psilocybin therapy in smokers. This was, really just meant to be more just like a clinical study to show that, smoking was decreased under the effects of after psilocybin therapy. But what was interesting is that they took the original sample, narrowed it down to 10 of the original 15, and then they said, hey, we played different types of music, and it didn't matter. That should have been a single statistic in the original paper. There is no reason to publish that, to say that the music doesn't matter. It's very possible that it doesn't. But it's just that that's not good evidence. That should have, again, been a single statistic in the original paper. Okay, there's also been this, work with Salvinorin A, where they had a study of 4 subjects that were administered Salvinorin A, and then they added 4 more subjects and then published another study. Salami slicing. That should just wait till you get your sample of 8. It's not that large. So, okay, but here's perhaps the biggest culprit of salami slicing. The imperial LSD and psilocybin data sets. I think at this point, a lot of people didn't realize this, but the vast majority of publications with fMRI tend to be based on these 2 data sets. People thought that they were all independent. They're not. And so the psilocybin data set is actually been narrowed down to only 9 subjects because it turns out 6 of the original moved a lot. And from my understanding, some of that movement actually led to findings that wouldn't necessarily replicate, that the motion actually correlated with some of the effects that are in that original PNAS psilocybin paper. That's actually from the words of somebody at Imperial themselves. And so the LSD data set has an N of 15. So you essentially have 20-something subjects across these 2 data sets that are now giving us all of what we think we know about psychedelics, this model, this deep follow network narrative model. So let me just show you how bad the salami slicing is. There's been 5 publications, this actually probably needs to be updated, that say that psychedelics increase complexity in the brain, all just based on these 2, an N of, let's say, 24. And they're all just different metrics of complexity. In fact, 2 of these studies use the exact same entropy analysis. 2 of these studies use the same Lempel-Ziv analysis. There's also situations that would be expected from complexity, such as the hierarchical organization of the brain no longer being as hierarchical would then be expected to produce more complexity. 2 separate publications showed how that hierarchical organization of the brain broke down, as well as an expansion of brain states. 2 separate publications found this. These are all based on just these 2 data sets. But here's where things get a little bit suspicious, if you ask me. So first of all, there's been some studies to their credit, they will take both data sets, which I think is wonderful. If you're going to do something like this, where you just want to look at a new measure that's supposed to support your model, at least use all the available data to you. But then there's been some studies where they left out the psilocybin data set. There's been some studies where they left out the LSD data set. And then there's been some studies where they did this, they basically ran the same analysis, but they published them independently. I don't know what to make of this. I hope that nobody's doing anything where they're like, I analyzed the LSD data set. Uh-oh, the effect didn't show up. Oh, but it showed up in the psilocybin data set and I'm going to publish it. I hope that never happened. But that's what the optics do look like that could be happening. So We are actually all of us in the, psychedelic resting state imaging world, which I don't even like to consider myself part of that world anymore, but, I do have some takes on it and I have published on it. We are all pooling our data together. There will hopefully be a paper that comes out within the next year. This has been like a nearly 3-year project. And the idea is I think in a year or two after, maybe 2 years, there's an embargo period, and then we're going to put all those data up online. So then nobody will have to look at just single data sets. If you're ever going to look at a resting state data set of a psychedelic, you will always have all these other data sets available to you, 100 plus subjects that you should analyze. And if I'm your reviewer for that single data set analysis and you don't show that it shows up in our 100 and something data set analysis, I will reject your paper. Okay, so here's a paper that was published that shows you just how much of a bias there is based on those data sets. This was published back in 2022. This has gotten even worse. But what you can see on the left-hand side here is here's all the publications based on that psilocybin data set. Here's all the publications at that time based on the LSD data set. And then here's the publications that were based on both, which again, I don't know why more people aren't using both data sets. So yeah, this is like, whereas all these other data sets that have more subjects in them that's represented by the larger shapes, they've only been published on a couple times or once even. So again, we're pooling all of these data sets and hopefully we'll be able to stop doing small sample resting state studies. Honestly, I feel like we should just stop doing resting state altogether, but whatever. Okay. So that's because, let me just mention one more thing about that resting state point is that your effects, a lot of these effects that we're showing within network, between network, entropy, they go away when people do tasks. And that's, I think, one reason why people aren't analyzing task-based fMRI data like they would analyze it like resting state, because it doesn't end up being as interesting. And I think that that's not because, for the reasons you think it is. I think it's because it's artifacts in how we're measuring the brain. That is, when you're doing rest, people are doing all kinds of rampant, unreliable things, and that when you scan people sober, they fall asleep in the scanner. So just putting that out there. Okay. So the next sin here is bias study designs and interpretations. Okay, so it's perhaps, no surprise that most psychedelic researchers have done the drugs and that this bias is the way that they design their studies and perhaps the way that they interpret their data. So I've just seen a lot of studies sometimes that I see in the psychedelic world where I learned this term. It's called duh science. It's a little bit like, why was that done? Like, have you ever seen studies where they give people cannabis and then show that, hey, people got the munchies? It's like, yeah, no shit. So likewise, I sometimes see these studies where it's like, oh, psychedelics alter metaphysical beliefs, or DMT induces entity encounters. Just to be clear, all psychedelics induce entity encounters. You just have to crank the dose up. DMT is a drug that it's actually less potent than psilocybin, milligram by milligram. You can give people like 10 to 20 milligrams, maybe even 30 milligrams of DMT intravenously. If you give people 3 milligrams of psilocybin, they'll start throwing up. So, but DMT is a drug that people can take at high doses because the effects will go away in 10 to 15 minutes. If you take a really high dose of psilocybin to see all these entities, you're going to be sitting with those entities for like 6 hours. So psychedelics, here's one. And this came from my old lab. Psychedelics induce mystical experiences. When I saw that paper, even as like a young person, I was like, that's what they decided to do with with the large, psychedelic study happening in the US. So here's a quote from Hamilton Morris that kind of summed up my feelings. When you look at, the Roland Griffiths work at Johns Hopkins, it got a huge amount of press, but the conclusion of that first clinical study was essentially that psilocybin is psychedelic. That was exactly my thoughts there. I just thought that really, this is what we're going to do. Like, why don't you tell me something I don't know? So, but here's, so let's now look at some cases in which the designs and the interpretation. So in those cases, it's like, okay, no one's going to argue with those findings because it was stuff that we already knew. But now let's look at some cases in which there was probably some bias in the way the studies were designed, as well as maybe the way the data were interpreted. So there was this study here. People of color in North America report improvements in racial trauma and mental health symptoms following psychedelic experiences. That sounds great, right? We need to focus more, I think, on those people who are marginalized. And it's nice to know that maybe psychedelics can help them. So, in the abstract itself, the first statistic, it literally says results revealed a significant and moderate reduction in traumatic stress symptoms from before to after the psychedelic experience. Wonderful, right? All right. Well, let's look at what some of the inclusion criteria were. So one of the inclusion criterion was that after taking the substance they had experience that they had an experience they believe contributed to relief from the challenging effects of ethnic discrimination. So, in other words, psychedelics relieve racial trauma, and people relieved from racial trauma after psychedelics. Don't make your results the same as your inclusion criterion. That is circular. That was an extremely biased design, and I cannot believe the reviewers did not catch this. That I honestly, yeah, that I kind of think that this paper should be withdrawn. Okay, there's also been this paper that come downs after MDMA. That this is a myth. It was called the myth of Blue Monday. This was a paper by Ben Sessa. If you all have seen what's going on recently with Ben Sessa, it's not great. This is a study of 14 patients with alcohol use disorder. They were given high doses of MDMA. So this is already not a super representative sample. And there was a critique of this paper that talked about the design of the study. There wasn't, I think, any like baseline measures. There also were a bunch of statistical issues. But here was an issue that I picked up on, and I kept trying to ping Ben Sessa with this, and all he told me was to read his paper. There was actually a paper back in 2001 that pulled across 3 separate studies of a bunch of participants at multiple doses. So they had 74 participants. And what they found was that this is only in the day after taking MDMA that people had more brooding and lack of energy. Keep in mind, Blue Monday is not because people were going to raves on Sunday. It's because they're going to raves on Saturday. A lot of times the come down might happen actually 2 days later. So this is potentially an underestimate. But they did find this back in 2001. And for whatever reason, this wasn't brought up in that Blue Mondays paper. So, okay, next thing. How about this one? LSD enhances emotional responses to music. So this seems solid, right? That essentially this was literally the thing. It was how emotionally affected were you by the music and then there was a Likert scale under placebo. People were somewhat emotionally affected. Under LSD, clearly it went up in basically every single participant. So this seems solid. It might seem a little bit like a piece of duh science, but let's see how this, there could have been some easy design tweaks that could have shown just how interesting this could be. But they didn't do it. So first of all, how do you think this graph would change if I went from how emotionally affected were you by the rock? And I don't mean rock music, I mean a literal rock. Chances are, if you gave somebody LSD and you showed them a rock, they're going to find it to be more emotionally interesting than when they're sober. Also, how would this change if we changed instead of LSD, we use cannabis? Chances are under cannabis, people are going to find music to be more emotionally interesting, or even cocaine, or even heroin, or even if we put heroin and a rock together. The point is that this study was extremely, the design of it was not really good to show that really what we wanted to see was some type of statistical interaction, that under the effects of LSD, everything becomes more emotional, but that perhaps that especially music is an important stimulus compared to, let's say, a rock, or let's say, people talking or scrambled sounds or whatever. Or that, let's say that LSD does this more so than other drugs. What they wanted to see was, what they should have shown was a statistical interaction. Instead, they showed a piece of duh science. Okay, but here's a less intuitive finding that ended up being biased by interpretations of what's been shown in the literature. So in this study, they actually had behavior, to their credit. And what they did was they did what's known as a temporal reproduction task. So I'll show you a red dot on the screen, and then I remove that red dot, and then I ask you to hold down a button for how long you thought that red dot was on the screen for. And so in this study, what they found is that so this line would be if they had perfect correspondence between how long they held the red button down for and how long the red dot was on the screen for. And so obviously people do not have perfect performance. Instead, you can see that people tend to under-reproduce under placebo and LSD. But what's interesting actually is that under LSD, these are microdoses that people tend to, microdoses and low doses, that people do tend to get close to that line. So you can actually see that performance was enhanced. This is one of the few instances in which microdosing actually enhanced performance of a cognitive task. However, there's only one other case in which microdosing has enhanced performance on a cognitive task. And guess what? Both of these studies did not let their participants drink caffeine. Um, I don't know about y'all, but I drink coffee every morning. I got my bean juice right here. I feel like maybe Europeans might drink coffee even more, and both these studies were conducted in Europe. So if you're sober and you're gonna be performing below baseline if they're not gonna let you drink coffee. And then if you're under a drug that wakes you up a little bit, now you're gonna perform better. So those aren't really good. That's not really good evidence of cognitive enhancement. Instead, it might be better evidence of showing that LSD can treat caffeine deprivation. Okay, but so the point though that I want to make here is that, so the point that they made here, sorry, is that because people held the red button down for longer, they interpreted this as temporal dilation. So the idea that, okay, time slows down, you're holding the button down for longer. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that these are microdoses. People don't tend to report temporal dilation under microdoses, they report it under large doses. The other issue is that there was this paper here that also used microdoses as well as full doses of psilocybin that was done. This is actually probably the first modern day microdosing study, but no one ever talks about it because the microdosing experiment was kind of tucked away in experiment two. But what they showed actually was that under psilocybin, people under reproduced, people over reproduced. People reproduce less compared to placebo. That is, they're holding down the button for less time compared to placebo, although still under reproducing. And so, first of all, you should get the same effects of LSD and psilocybin. They both produce, temporal dilation. This study had a microdosing condition, and they found the same effects as when you gave a full dose. But more importantly, this whole design, regardless of what you find, cannot be interpreted as temporal dilation or temporal compression. And here's why. So let's go through this little thought experiment again. So let's pretend you see a red dot on the screen for 2 seconds. And you think to yourself, that's on the screen for 2 seconds. And you hold down the button for, some amount of error. Let's say you hold it down for 2.5 seconds or something. Okay, now let's pretend you see that red dot on the screen while you're on LSD. You see it on the screen for 2 seconds, but time is now dilated by a factor of 2. So you're like, oh my God, man, that was on the screen for like 4 seconds. How long are you going to hold down the red button for? So I always like to do this like demonstration live, and then somebody will yell out 4 seconds, right? So then I have to rephrase the question. How long would you perceive, if time's dilated by a factor of 2, how long would you perceive yourself holding the red button for if you're holding it down for 2 seconds? Well, the idea is you would perceive it as being held down for 4 seconds. In which case, after you've only seen it for 2 seconds, in which case you should let go. So in other words, you should just hold it down for 2 seconds. So why, in other words, would observing a red dot on the screen feel longer under LSD, but not observing yourself holding down a button under LSD feel like it's longer as well? So this paper committed what's known as the El Greco fallacy. This is an assumption that particular perceptual abnormalities will influence interactions with the world of a similar nature. And so the idea was that essentially there's this Renaissance painter, El Greco. He tended to paint the world in an elongated fashion. And the idea was that maybe he had a astigmatism, and that's why he painted everything in an elongated fashion. But if you think about it, after he looks at his paintings that are elongated, he should, let's say he sees the world as being twice as long. When he looks at his painting, it should still be perceived as twice as long if he's painting it longer. He should paint it, when he paints what he sees in the world, he should paint it exactly like identically to what the way he sees it, which would be, it'll look to us as, which would look to us as being the same. And to him, what looks to us as the same will be longer. So people have actually used the El Greco fallacy to kind of go against some very sexy findings in psychology. I totally recommend reading this paper by Chaz Firestone. Okay, we are at the last sin, and this involves overpromising the mind-revealing potential of psychedelics. So there's this idea that psychedelics mean mind revealing. People love to talk about psychedelics and consciousness and that, oh, these drugs are going to teach us so much about consciousness and the mind and whatnot. First of all, it's unclear to me why psychedelics are more applicable to consciousness or altered states of consciousness than other drugs or other psychological manipulations. It's kind of unclear to me, like, what are you altered from in the first place? What does this altered state even mean? If you think about it, like all manipulations in psychology are an alteration of your consciousness. When I show you a stimulus and I try to manipulate your memory, make it better or worse, your memory being better or worse are different states of consciousness. In cognitive psychology and neuroscience, typically the term consciousness is kind of limited to studies of things like awareness or priming, so like subliminal priming. Even though you're not conscious of a stimulus, you can still get an impact on your behavior. What's interesting in studies like this, psychedelics actually increase the threshold for conscious visual perception. People love thinking, oh, psychedelics make you more conscious. Well, in these studies, they're actually showing that your consciousness to the world's actually decreased. Okay, so what have psychedelics revealed to us about the mind? This is a question that if there's some, hopefully there'll be some time. I'm going to try to run through this. I would love for anybody to tell me what we've learned about the mind or some underlying principle of the brain from psychedelic research. There's actually been similar arguments made about fMRI, that we've learned nothing about the mind or brain from fMRI. I like fMRI, and I don't think that's totally true, although I do think there's an argument to be made that there's been a bunch of superfluous, like fMRI brain research that's told us absolutely nothing about the mind. It's probably not the case that psychedelics will solve the hard problem of consciousness. That's something, I've written about as well. It's probably not the case that, so is it the case that there's maybe personal revelation? So forget like underlying principles about the mind, but maybe perhaps people can have some like more personal revelations. So this is kind of difficult to interpret the veracity of these interpretations due to their like autobiographical nature. Like somebody might say, oh, I might have like, oh, I'm on psychedelics. Oh, it turns out I did have a bad relationship with my mother. And, there's probably obvious cases where there was a bad relationship that people didn't recognize, but there's other situations where it's like, well, this is a little subjective, what's good and bad. And so I think there's a really nice quote from Anne Shulgin that kind of summarizes that idea. Funny, I'd forgotten that what comes to you when you take a psychedelic is not always a revelation of something new and startling. You're more liable to find yourself reminded of simple things you know and forgot you knew, seeing them freshly, old basic truths that long ago became cliches, so you stop paying attention to them. But what, types of things to the individual might they reveal that would be true evidence? Well, one is there's this idea that psychedelics might be able to recover memories. I don't buy that at all. There's actually very little evidence in the first place for repressed memories. And instead, people have shown that a lot of times when you try to get people to retrieve memories that you tell them are repressed, you'll get false memories. And in fact, if you have people retrieve memories on various drugs, they will increase false memories. Now, we're not talking about encoding, like forming memories. We're talking about retrieving. What about metacognition? So this is the idea that, having some type of being able to introspect on your own cognitive processes and understand your capacities better. Might psychedelics enhance metacognition? So I have data on both of these things. First of all, we had an MDMA study where we did administer MDMA during memory retrieval only. And we did actually find some evidence that MDMA led to more false memories. People are claiming they saw a bunch of things that they never actually saw. We are hopefully going to do this study with psilocybin. What about metacognition? Well, there's different ways of measuring metacognition. This is kind of thought to be the gold standard. If you talk to metacognitive researchers, they've definitely got various opinions, but we found no evidence that MDMA at encoding or retrieval really could enhance metacognition. Neither did psilocybin at 3 different doses. In my more recent paper with psilocybin and 2CB, we had emotional stimuli. And we actually found that some evidence, you have to go to the supplement though, because a different analysis, this analysis did not hold up very well. But essentially that for negative stimuli and neutral stimuli, your ability to introspect how well your confidence aligns with your memory actually got worse. So that's not mind revealing. That is revealing less about what you know about your memory. However, there did appear to be this enhancement of positive meta memory. So people are now talking about, how confident they are and what they think they actually saw. And it did seem to align better with their memory. And by the way, that MDMA study did have negative, neutral, and positive material. And when we separated them, negative and neutral stuff didn't hold up. There did appear to be this trend for an enhancement in positive meta memory. I think this effect needs to be replicated. I will hopefully actually have some data on this soon. I'm not sure if it'll replicate, frankly, and we do try to be a little nuanced about it. Okay, so what might psychedelics teach us about the mind? I don't want to be a total negative Nancy here. So I think that there's some reliable distortions from psychedelics like color constancy, and perhaps others that are yet to be discovered. I don't know if you saw, there's this whole thing about if you look at if you're on DMT with a laser, you can see some weird symbols or something. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if it's actually reserved to DMT or red lasers, but supposedly some people on the internet said that that's a thing. I think that might tell us something really interesting about symbol processing, if that really is true. And so visual vision scientists will actually use visual illusions to also try to reveal imperfect algorithms underlying mental function. You've probably all seen this little checkerboard illusion. So that A and B, those checkers are actually the exact same color. And I can show you this by taking out the context of B. So as I start to add more and more and more, now you can see that A and B are more similar color. Right here, they look, different colors. Now they look the same, right? So that tells you about like kind of imperfect ways in which we integrate or average information to perceive brightness. So I think similarly, we could do something like this with psychedelics. There's also some other distortions that we could think about under psychedelics that are quite reliable, or somewhat reliable anyways. It's interesting that psychedelics evoke this noetic quality or presque vu, this illusory feeling of insight, especially insights about what the mind is. We're like, oh, people will leave an experience and be like, I now understand consciousness, right? But they're not winning the Nobel Prize. So I'm not really sure if they are understanding consciousness. And why is it as psychedelic research, we get to throw around the word consciousness all the time when experimental psychologists, we don't see them throwing around this word all the time. I think that's a bit of psychedelic exceptionalism. And in the center that I used to work for, note that it could have just as easily been the Center for Psychedelic and Psychological Research, but instead it was the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. A little backstory to that. Fred Barrett, Matt Johnson, and myself, we were all against the idea of putting the word consciousness in there. And now that Roland's passed, I mean, honestly, now that he's actually admitted in that New York Times article to of doing the drugs, what he said to us is, "Well, where did this all begin for you?" In other words, alluding to, did you do the drugs and did you feel like you were getting some insight into consciousness from these drugs? And so, yeah, this is like, there's something about why psychedelic researchers want to keep using this word consciousness, probably because, they've gotten some, they've felt like they've taken the drug and they've gotten some type of insight. And so, but my problem with this is that why does psychedelic induced insights get the benefit of the doubt? Why is it people with schizophrenia feel like they have insights all the time, and we don't give them the benefit of the doubt? Well, it's because most psychedelic researchers have done the drugs and they think that what they're thinking is probably true. So how now can this be explained? So I think this might come from, I'm going to go back to some of my memory stuff, what's known as misattributions of processing fluency. So processing fluency is the ease of information processing, especially after processing identical or related stimuli. Essentially, that familiarity memory process is the attribution of processing fluency to episodic memory. You see a stimulus again, it's processed more easily. You don't have an explicit episodic memory to be able to say, oh, I saw that person yesterday at this time. Just something about them feels more familiar or more easily processed. And then you attribute that processing fluency to your memory, and therefore they feel familiar. But processing fluency can also be influenced in other ways, or it can also be attributed in other ways, misattributed, I should say. There's the mere exposure effect. So this is essentially the familiarity breeds fondness effect. If I show you a face multiple times over, you're eventually going to rate it as more attractive, more likable, etc. There's also what's known, and perhaps this is related to psychedelics, as the illusory truth effect. If I show you a statement over and over and over again, you're going to be more likely to rate it as true. The feeling, and in fact, that feeling of insight itself, people have evoked without psychedelics, that can be misattributed to irrelevant ideas and can increase their truthiness or how plausible somebody thinks an idea is. And what's interesting is that without hippocampal dependent memory, these types of effects, these types of cognitive distortions can really go up. That is, if you don't have the hippocampus to be able to localize that source of fluency, like, oh, why does this person feel so familiar? Well, I probably like them. That's why, but instead it's like, oh, why does this person feel so familiar? Oh, I saw them yesterday. Now you're actually going to reduce that illusory truth effect. So I've actually shown that when hippocampal memory is lower, you can a lot of times get these misattributions, and you manipulate people's processing fluency, you can get false memories. People have also shown you can get feelings of déjà vu when this hippocampal dependent recollection fails and familiarity or fluency is high. You can get déjà vu, you can get feelings of insight, you can even get premonition. If all those things don't sound like someone on psychedelics to you, I don't know what does. So the last thing I'm going to present to you is this model of psychedelic drug action that I have been wanting to write about, but we'll see when I have the time to finally do it. I call it fluency exaggeration or flux. And so the basic premises are that serotonin 2A receptors are largely distributed on excitatory neurons in the cortex, but inhibitory neurons in the hippocampus. And then that hippocampal, it has been shown, this is based on resting state data, I'll be honest, that there's a decoupling between the hippocampus and the cortex that has now been replicated across several different groups, as well as in animals. And that psychedelics impair this encoding of hippocampal dependent memories, but they spare or enhance the encoding of cortical dependent memories. And so there might be, because of this, exaggerations of processing fluency that can become misattributed. So one source will just be simply by activating the serotonin 2A receptors in the cortex. So by increasing their excitability, when you see a stimulus, you should get greater cortical activation. However, greater cortical activation is actually associated with more novelty. What will happen is if you get greater novelty initially, there'll be more processing of that information. What comes with more processing will subsequently come with less activity because it will come with more fluency. And that this could be what's resulting in our familiarity effects, fluency effects, et cetera, like semantic priming. But then also, without the hippocampus to constrain that spread of cortical activation, you can now you can get more spread of cortical activation, which is going to result in more fluency, as well as you're going to get more misattributions of that fluency. It's actually been shown that under REM sleep, a state in which people will sometimes compare to psychedelics, that there's also less constraints of the hippocampus on the cortex. This, by the way, goes against Rebus, which would say that under psychedelics, you get more constraints on the cortex from the hippocampus. This is a totally direct opposite prediction. And the resting state functional connectivity data, oddly enough, supports my hypothesis, not Rebus. But I don't want to end on this bad note of misattributions of fluency, misattributions of insight. There is some potential good here that can be. So by being able to removing the constraints of the hippocampus, you might be able to find more novel solutions in kind of familiar semantic space. You also might be able to facilitate cortical learning. Maladaptive beliefs like the world is dangerous or that I'm a terrible human being, these things that happen in, disorders like PTSD and depression. These are essentially semantic memories that not everybody shares. They've become coded over 10 years of thinking you're a terrible human being. That becomes a fact. It's like George Washington is the first president of the country. Pizza contains cheese, tomato sauce, and bread. I'm a terrible human being. All those things are held on the same level of belief. And so it can be really difficult to disrupt these maladaptive beliefs. But if you can facilitate cortical learning, that could be useful. It's also, worth noting, as I mentioned, that semantic priming, it seems to be enhanced, especially for distant primes. So again, you might be able to find novel solutions. I think there's this really cool, actually, finding in the literature, in the memory literature called the memory blocking effect, where hippocampal dependent memory can actually limit finding a solution to a problem. And so what it is, for example, is I'll give you the word balloon, and then I'll later on give you this little puzzle to solve, BAL blank ON blank. Balloon can't fit in those blanks, but because I've given you a hippocampal dependent memory for balloon, you're unable to find the solution, balcony. So with that, these are the Cinco sins that I have now thrown at you. I'm hoping that, hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you don't think I'm somewhat justified, but I'm sure I seem probably like a little bit like a critical asshole. But the last little concept I want to put out there is psychedelic myopia, and why I think we need to be studying other things in psychedelics as psychedelic researchers, and why we need to be really careful about what we can interpret from our personal whatever happens to us personally under the effects of these drugs. That we shouldn't necessarily interpret. We should, if anything, hold the opposite views that what happens to us probably doesn't happen to others because these drugs are so variable. And so essentially what psychedelic myopia is, it's the type of psychedelic exceptionalism for these scientific studies, that it's short-sighted thinking due to a narrow scope of interests or biases from personal use, that psychedelics are a case of drug or psychological manipulation to which standard rules of scientific inquiry don't apply or to which special rules should apply. So, for example, people will say psychedelics are superior mind revealing agents. I've learned absolutely nothing about the mind from psychedelics, from psychedelic research, I should say. Can't study behavior on psychedelics due to generalized disengagement or the uncertainty principle. Again, that is very, I think I showed you some unique effects of psychedelics, some cognitive enhancements under the effects of psychedelics that generalized disengagement can't explain. And let's just laugh at the uncertainty principle. The entropic brain this is a quote. The entropic brain hypothesis proposes that blank, assuming that the brain and mind are flip sides of the same coin. That is literally what every cognitive neuroscientist does. Is we assume that the mind is directly produced from the brain. There's nothing about psychedelics that should have ever been stated. Psychedelic specific terminology. I really hate these terms that, there's already stuff that exists in the literature for set and setting outside of psychedelics, such as one's kind of background knowledge or semantic memory, their traits, their personality traits, the state in which they're in, their emotional state, and then the context. There's also like pivotal mental states. There was already a term for this known as critical periods. So learn the literature. Don't just study psychedelics. It will get you into a lot of trouble with me. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end this with a Michael Pollan quote that I think really describes psychedelic myopia. One of the things that commend travel, art, nature, work, and certain drugs, i.e., psychedelics, to us is that the way these experiences at their best block every mental path forward and back, immersing us in the flow of a present that is literally wonderful. If that doesn't sound like myopia to you, I don't know what does. So that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry, I did go to an hour and a half. And here's my Twitter and Blue Sky if you use those things.